So appreciate you joining us again here backstage for some extended conversation. The time, as we noted, is so short. And
Yeah.
one of the things, Tom, that I was struck by when you were talking at the end, and I don't know what made me think about this, but I thought about maybe because you were talking about communities of faith. And one of the things that Teddy Fullenwider, who's our social justice chair, commented in the comments on Facebook. She said that, we do need to work on this in communities of faith, and especially because I think we think we're doing a good job, right? That kind of, well, it's not me, it must be somebody else. And I don't know how I got from there to, but I thought about how, especially in worship, we weaponize time, right? Yes. We weaponize the clock. Now, when I say we need to be done at noon, I don't mean to be weaponizing anything. But for someone who doesn't have my sense of time, who isn't clock driven, that is a kind of weaponizing, isn't it?
Yes. So 2 years ago, so I'm in the D-Min program at Eden Seminary here in St. Louis. And so every Wednesday we have chapel. And 2 years ago, chapel was led by our Ascend group, which is African American international students group. And it was a little different for some of my white colleagues because they're used to being set to time, and in African American congregations, that is not necessarily an issue. They go as long as the Spirit says they need to go. It's a little harder in a seminary setting because they want to set the Spirit at 45 minutes ish. But I do, I think that, and one of the challenges that I face is that with some of my folks, they're bent out of shape if we're not out if we go to 10:15 or 10:20, they've been used to getting out in an hour. And that's a struggle. The time thing has changed for me somewhat in this pandemic mess. But yeah, I do think we want to weaponize it and use it as a means of control, I guess.
Yeah.
I think we always, when we use the word weaponizing, we immediately think of Amy Cooper, right? We think of really obvious examples of whiteness being used against somebody else, and not so much of these other little things where whiteness or white norms have they have limited the freedom and ability of people who are not white
to be
fully who live into themselves.
Live it right.
So I don't want to preclude touching on anything that came up that anyone else is passionate about, but barring anything, I'd like to go back to what Freedom said about letting whiteness, not just letting, but insisting that whiteness enter the conversation. That's not quite how you put it, but can you take us back to what you were saying?
Yeah. So Robin DiAngelo, in her book White Fragility, I've read this book like 3 or 4 times, and I'm still reading it. And I'm reading it because it's such a deep study to the conversation that we're in and have been in for a long, long time. But we're finally now having these intentional conversations, right? So she really helps the reader to understand that historically we have never, whites have never embraced that they are a part of the racial hierarchy, that they're a part of the racial construction. It's always been, no, that's them over there. That's not me. And so what she has realized, even in her experience, she said she was hired as a diversity and inclusion director, and it had no experience, had just graduated from undergrad, and because she was a white woman, she knew that she was given that opportunity, and there were other candidates that she was very well aware of who had more experience, but they were people of color. She had to begin asking herself, why was that privilege given to her? And in her time of teaching diversity and inclusion trainings in her job, she recognized that by some of her Black peers that they were offended by her inability to recognize her superiority and her privilege, that fostered her ability to gain access and entry way into certain spaces that they could not. Even the ability to challenge white people on their racism, she speaks to, that is a form of white privilege. Being able to challenge white people on the nuances of how their whiteness works to harm is a example of white privilege. And so what's so beautiful is how methodically she takes the reader through understanding that whiteness is a part of the conversation. It is the conversation. It is the foundation of this system of racism. And that's how we begin to deconstruct and reconstruct a new reality.
Can I say something?
No, please jump in.
It's really making me think of those of us at the Hymn Society. Dr. Alicia Jones spoke about decolonizing worship, and this goes to the point that you brought up about controlling time in worship. And Ruth Duck in Worship for the Whole People of God is one of the first people to, as Reverend Free said, to recognize whiteness, but to recognize that whiteness as a form of worship to help to this process of decolonizing worship. As a worship professor, we're constantly keeping that in mind because, you know, if anything is outside of a very white European North American mode of worship, it's often not even considered worship or deemed worthy of being studied. And so, as Reverend Free said, one of those first steps is to, you know, recognize there is a form of white worship. Of course, that's not monolithic, just as, you know, African American worship is not monolithic. But first, to make that step to say this is a form of worship and this is a style of worship, among many others, I think is one of the first steps to help decolonize it, and also recognize that we've created these hierarchies of what we consider to be proper worship or good worship. And as you mentioned, part of that is it has to fit in a certain time frame.
On that as well, when I was in seminary and I took systematic theology, we had an assignment to take one classical theologian and read them and one contextual theologian. So the classical theologians were Augustine, Calvin, Barth, because I went to Princeton, so of course Barth, Whitehead, and the contextual theologians were Cone, Gutierrez. There was like a feminist theologian reader that was an Asian theologian reader. There was no queer theology, of course, because that did not exist at Princeton when I was there. And it really struck me on that the use of the word contextual, that this idea that Calvin and Augustine and Barth don't have context, when they absolutely do. Calvin makes a lot more sense when you realize that, like, people were still being burned at the stake as witches. There's so much about how that context works in that helps us understand that and helps us to challenge that and see what is good about that and what we can lay aside. But this sense that it was only the non-white males that had context is contributing to this invisibility for us, for a lot of white people, where we've never had to think about it. We've always been in the dominant culture. And then one of the things that ends up happening when we are confronted with it is we get defensive. Because we're, as respectfully borrowing words from Reverend Denise Anderson, former co-moderator of the PCUSA, we're late. We are late to the conversation, and we are defensive about that. And so often, instead of actually owning that and working out our feelings in a place with other white people who've been on this road a little bit longer, we bring that into spaces. We put that on Black people, and then we're centering ourselves again. And suddenly it becomes all about catering to our emotions as opposed to actually getting anything done.
I hear an amen, even though the mic is muted. Mic is muted. I'm still trying to get past the statement that you had systematic theology at Princeton, but no, I'm kidding. I mean, how is Whitehead not contextual? I mean, come on.
Well, and Augustine was not white,
right?
But because the church has, absorbed him into their whiteness, that was white, like Jesus, right?
Yeah, like Jesus. I'm reminded, Slats, when you said invisibility, and through all this, I've been reminded of Darnell's metaphor that he gave us several weeks ago when he came as a guest speaker. Most of you know Darnell St. Romain, also a graduate of Perkins. He said, whiteness is the blank sheet of paper. And I have to fit on the paper. I have to find myself on the paper. And I think what I'm hearing you say, Reverend Free, is that by calling whiteness but the blank sheet of paper, it allows it to be invisible. We look at it, we say, it's just a blank piece of, there's nothing there, right? But we've got to name that in and of itself is the whiteness, right? And start owning that has all sorts of implications to it. And it places us, it contextualizes us, it limits and defines us as us against an other. It's one of the things that I said to Slats and Steph when I invited them in, and they both said, I'm not sure I have anything to offer here. And I said, well, I think entering in through the gateway of gender may be helpful for people, because we all know, going back to, it's about accommodating my emotions as a white person. When I hear white or whiteness, I emotionally shut down, right? The wall goes up. The roaring starts in my ears. I can't hear anything else. Because I don't want to hear that. Because I don't want to own that. Because I don't want it to exist. Because I've been taught my entire life that it doesn't exist. There's nothing there. It's just a blank sheet of paper. And yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is, I think just going back to this, this use of this metaphor of a white sheet of paper, we have to, when we think about, I think that's a beautiful example, because it still is something, right? Like although it is a sheet of paper, it is a sheet of paper. It is a white sheet of paper. What constructs that white sheet of paper, right? So if I'm white writing on that piece of paper, with a blue pen or a green pen or a black pen or a red pen. I'm still writing on what is the frame of what I should be on that sheet of paper, right? And so I think it's definitely, I think that example is such a very easy connected example that anyone can relate to, because it's trying to fit everyone into this ideal of what is appropriate, what is norm, what has been normalized, right? What is right, what is wrong, and who said? Like, for me, I just have to ask myself, so wait, okay, so I remember when I was a kid, my grandmother would say, well, you're not supposed to do that. And I'm like, why? I'm a firstborn. So as a firstborn, I was always the one who found myself more kind of challenging and trying to ask more questions. And the why was always like, who said? Like, who said I couldn't do this? Mm-hmm. Right? Who said this was wrong? And so now what I'm seeing, just using this example of this white piece of paper, who said we have to fit on this white sheet of paper? Who said that this has to be the way? And why was that class group of people given permission to dictate how everyone else should live? Like, who said? And so it's, yeah, I think it's a very good example. I appreciate Darnell's example with the piece of paper.
Steph. No, you don't have to raise your hand. Just jump in.
I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but adding on to that notion of the white piece of paper, I think it's really important in talking about constructs of race and gender, how much white men who are scientists or biologists have helped to create that white sheet of paper of saying what is normal, what is not, what is good, what is bad, as well as Christianity. What is God-given, what is natural. This comes into play a lot with race, but also very much so with gender, and enforcing complementarity and the notion that there are only male and female and nothing else. That white piece of paper, as Rev Free said, who's deciding? Straight white men are deciding, and they're using their interpretations of science, as well as Christian interpretations, to enforce what that white sheet of paper is.
Yeah, it struck me, Reverend Free, as you were talking, that the paper, I mean, even using paper as a metaphor, assumes a written technology, a visual technology. It precludes an auditory technology, right? So who's to say if we're in an oral culture, an oral culture, we don't even need paper. Like, that doesn't even need to be our construct. And paper isn't even naturally white, right? I mean, we do all these processes.
And we're done. That's it.
We do all of these
and we're done. Yeah.
To make it invisible, right? To play as if it were not a construct, right? So that it can disappear into the background.
It's a little late afternoon conversation.
Yeah.
So
one of the, go ahead.
No, I can come back to what I was thinking about. Go where you wanted to go.
No, so this conversation is interesting because I'm still struggling with what my project is going to be for this degree. And my initial thought was trying to find the intersection between racism or whiteness and gender. And I have struggled with this. It's been on my mind for a long time. I just wasn't sure how I could get there. There's a way to get there based on the conversation that we've had. There's a lot of intersectionality between these two issues, which I would argue are probably the two most important issues, not just in society, but in the life of the church. We were talking about transgender earlier. 3 years ago, there was a Rolling Stoneway conference was here, and I led the music for it. And one of the things that was said was that the church needed to really give more, and this is 2017, the church needed to invest as much energy in supporting and encouraging people who are transgendered as we did for our queer and LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And I agree, and I agree with that. But I think those two areas are the two areas where the church is going to need to really address itself. The challenge, I think, is which one do you do first, or do you just say the hell with it and try to do both?
I mean,
random thoughts.
I would just point out that part of the reason why we're in this place where the particularly gay and lesbian movement has kind of come so far, and the trans section has not, and then bisexuals are just kind of ignored by everyone, is because early on, at least in this country, early on in the Pride movement, particularly white, gay, and lesbian folks moved away from the origins of Pride, which was Black, primarily Black and Latinx, trans and gender nonconforming folks. And so that there was a movement that was a more intersectional movement of Pride, but then it shifted towards marriage equality, which, while I'm grateful for it, it is why I'm married right now, is not the most pressing issue for a lot of the community. And so it really went to, what do the white, wealthier parts of the community need? And they got the attention first. And so there's a tremendous amount of racism within the LGBTQIA community that we have to work on. And so I feel like we have to be doing both. And that was actually that was the spirit that inspired Pride all along. But whiteness and wealth, as it does, co-opted that.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. I mean, I actually know this history, but so white people, in this instance, white gay people came in and colonized something that was already there. What? Yeah.
I said, I know, it's so surprising.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
I want to. I'd like to come back to the idea. Well, no, I don't. It strikes me that the question I want to ask deals again with the distance between intent and experience, because I want to come back to Reverend Free's comment at the beginning when she said, "I'm not sure why I was invited. Like, why is this my role?" That may not have been the exact words, but that's kind of what I'm paraphrasing here. So, at least Slats and Tom and Steph, because you're the ones I talked to directly, I think I explained to you when the reason these conversations came about is because in our community, when we came together after George Floyd's murder to say how we're going to respond, our two answers were, we need to be in this for the long haul.
Yes.
So we have got to look at sustained change over time, not jump out in the public square and make a statement. We are doing that, but we're not taking the lead on that. We let others do that. So long term, and it needs to be based in first educating ourselves. We are not going to jump out and be advocates until we know what we're talking about. And so that was the whole reason. Let's create a space where we can unpack some of these issues, educate ourselves and our community. And again, the intent was to give space for voices and experiences of color to take the lead on framing the issue. Now, the distance between intent and experience may have been from space to take the lead to responsibility. So how can we close that gap? What is our role? How can we shape this better, that it's more productive and doesn't become another white responsibility being forced on voices of color?
Yeah, that is a really good question. That is a really good question. So as we know, like, racism, the definition, one phrase in the definition talks about personal intent, right? It talks about how one has to be personally, intentionally trying to cause harm based upon someone's identity, right? And so we're having this conversation where we're looking at, it's always, me as a Black woman, let me just start there. Me as a Black woman, I've found that my role has always been to educate white women or white men on the harm that they're doing to people of color. So my role as a chaplain at the bedside, educating physicians, but going back to what Slats had mentioned, having a conversation with people of white people in a room together. There are already many books. We got color. I have so many different Black authors on my shelf that have spoke about racism and have spoke about the nuances of whiteness and the nuances of identity politics, which is what we're talking about, right? I have so many different authors, from James Cone to W.E.B. Du Bois to Terry McMillan. Like, these conversations, like Slat said, it's just, you guys are late to the party. We've been having these conversations for a long time, right? So it's I think the burden comes yet again for me as a Black woman. I'm not speaking for all Black women. I'm talking about me personally. It's not our role to educate white people on their racism.
Right.
That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is, when it happens, is to claim our boundary and our life-given dignity, and to say, no, this isn't appropriate, and let me tell you why. And then that's it. And it's white people's responsibility to go back and deal with the messiness of their emotions, the frustration, the anger, the I'm offended, the sadness, the weeping. Why did that trigger me like that? Like, why did that bother me? Is there some truth in what was said? Was I being a tyrant? Was I being offensive? Was I being rude? Was I being harmful? But it's going back to this white shift paper. That is not something that whites have had to be responsible to do, because every other race has to cater to the emotional response of the white person. So we're always in an object in and juxtaposition to. And so it's like, whoa, so now I'm having to monitor someone's feelings, make sure I'm not offending, but I may have been slighted the entire time. So the reason why I said that, I was like, okay, I was kind of wrestling with, should I come to the conversation, goes right back to me feeling the need to help define this conversation for white people, but this conversation has been defined many times over. And so I think what could be helpful to answer that question is, what does it look like to have a forum with white males having a conversation about how they have benefited from the design of white supremacy? And let us see them on full display with their emotional fragileness and all the offense that will take place, right? And let someone who is doing the work, another white male who is doing the work and challenging them on their BS, right? Mm-hmm. Because if we're talking about a hierarchical structure, still today in power, when you look at the Senate and the House, and you look at education, and you look at CEOs across this world, it is white males, right? They are still the ones who are making decisions and governing our policies and our procedures. And so I'm not saying never to have a Black person to enter into this conversation, but I'm saying if we're going to talk about this structure that's in place, we have to start with either who's at the top, or if you want to invert it, who's at the bottom, right, of this structure. And so I think that conversation needs to be a grappling with white males, white clergy who are, right, white CEOs, right, white principals, people who are white physicians, having this conversation with people who are in those places of strong influence and strong power, so that they can begin to grow and mature and heal.
I would draw attention to, and it just happened a couple of weeks ago. So there was a conversation or a meeting between Black leaders, NAACP, several other places with Zuckerberg. Those kind of conversations need to go on. And if you remember, Zuckerberg, God love him, is clueless. He's absolutely clueless, and he knows that they're right. He knows, but he can't respond. That's the kind of conversations that need to happen, at least on a social level. In the matter of in the context of the church, that those conversations need to happen between leaders in the majority of the predominant denominations. The leadership is white. You won't find a Black Southern Baptist in any role of leadership in that denomination. They don't exist. Perhaps in some others, but I think Rev Free's right. That's where these conversations have to initiate or have to begin, and they have to be, and they come with the understanding that they're going to be difficult, not insulting, but difficult and honest, and you're willing to basically take a no holds barred if we want to get to where we need to go. For us, for Freedom's Church, I basically said to our church council, the time has come. And it was after Floyd and after a number of things. Actually, it was after Floyd and after the situation at Lafayette Square. I said in a meeting, I said, the time has come to have this conversation. And so this is what I'm doing in the fall. And those of you who want to come and be a part, I welcome you. But you need to know that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be sugar-coated. We're going to speak frankly, or we're going to speak honestly. I've had several of my members who are asking me, so what is it that I need to do? And it's like, it's what you need to do. There's a lot that needs to be done, but I can't give you an answer right here in the middle of the parking lot. Other than to say that this is a conversation that we've got to have so that you understand, what does it, if it's being an ally, that's fine. I don't like necessarily using that word, but for lack of a better word, it's the same. It's the same thing of what does it mean to be an ally for trans and queer people? Well, it's not just I need to. You say you say this, you say that, but it's more than that. It's a step beyond. It's probably several steps beyond.
Wow.
Just tell me when the doctor's panel is going to be. Tell me when the doctor's panel will be. I definitely want to hear that.
Where we will be doing health disparities. Yes, and so you will definitely be on that one. Because several of the things that you said, I was like, oh, Cassie talks about that stuff too. so definitely. I think what's interesting about, especially the last few minutes that we were just talking about, what we can do differently in this particular thing that we're doing, and I'm, as you were talking, Free, I was kind of thinking, okay, so were we giving into fragility by trying to make it like piecemeal? And because what we decided to do was to take this image that we found and start helping people understand what these words meant, right? Helping white people understand what these words meant so that they would not be as upset when people use them. And they would be aware and start making changes instead of just like ripping off the Band-Aid and saying, screw everything, you gotta do it this week. And so, is it a necessity for us in some ways to just be more aggressive about it? And especially in our congregation, we're talking about doing, a study. One of our Sunday school groups has already done white fragility. Two now. That's right. Another one started it. Doing one with the rest of the congregation with white fragility. A few people. One of the Sunday school classes is starting raising white kids. So so we're trying to do, I think, that kind of work you're talking about of holding one another accountable, and so.
Now I'm sitting here wondering, like maybe the backstage conversation needs to be me sitting down with 5 white guys saying, okay, you just heard this conversation. Now, how does that make you feel? What do you think about
I agree with that.
What? Okay.
She's signing up. She's like, I'll watch it every week.
I will watch it every single week. Like, I will be on Twitter like, hey guys, you don't understand that.
That's right.
Is going crazy. Look at this. Yeah, seriously, because I know I understand the metaphor of ripping off the Band-Aid, but like 400 plus years, Black people have been suffering from this kind of like this pain of our identity, right? Like, we don't live in a culture or in an environment where we can go out and kind of like tiptoe into our world. Like, I go to the grocery store, I go to the car wash, I sit on my patio. I live in a predominantly Indian and white neighborhood. Like, people are like, I see their faces when they walk by my garden and they're like, it's a Black woman. Like, it's startling. So the Band-Aid is ripped off of me every single time I'm outside, right? So I know sometimes for the sake of trying to be cautious and gentle that we do this because we don't want people to run away, right? We don't want people to run away from the conversation. But I think going back to what Tom said, that the time is now. Like, we have to have the hard conversations. The Band-Aid is already ripped off. Like, the Band-Aid has been ripped off, and now we have to have these conversations. And I think it's particularly important to have them with people who are in power, people who, and particularly white men in power. And those conversations be facilitated by someone who is truly, honestly, intentionally doing the work to help heal that consciousness, because it's so important. Those persons can change the trajectory of people who are of a lesser class or of a lesser hierarchy. And we just have to say it what it is. Like, we are still in a hierarchy of where the dominant culture is white males. And so that conversation, we need to have those conversations with them. I like the idea of the what is it, behind the scenes, backstage happening, and how they feel about it.
Oh,
Jeffrey, does your church, either one of your churches have a you have a church library?
no. No.
If I were you, or I would suggest, particularly now, is that you find some folks in your church who would be willing to donate some books dealing with white privilege, or the Kendi book, just make available to them resources that they can read, so that when you have the discussion or discussions, they're in a position to ask. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt for them to read at all. Ooh. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sitting here, I'm thinking maybe. What would you say, Tom?
No, what I will do is I will send you I did a bibliography for my project, and I'll send it to you. And some of them are books that I've read parts of, but I'm finding that so this whole process is new for me, and this is a conversation we have at another time. But I think the more resources you make available to your congregations on this issue, that will be helpful. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it may spark some questions too.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, and I'm gonna give some serious consideration to what I'm thinking of titling "Face to Face with Racism" WWE edition.
I want to know who the 5 black persons you're gonna invite.
No, it's going to be white men who have to wrestle.
Oh, white men.
Yeah,
with their own,
right.
With their own white maleness.
There you go.
All right.
we're definitely been trying to resource and give different things, so that's helpful. And any resources that you have,
yeah,
free, if you'll text me pictures of those books, and I'll get them on the list. We lost Tom. Tom pushed the wrong button. That's fine.
I have not let the clock be our weapon, but we are past the time that we set aside, and so I want to honor that you all may have things to go on to do. I really am grateful for your willingness to step into this space and take up take up a job and a responsibility that is not yours. Tom's coming back online. Um,
Hi
Tom,
there.
yeah.
Welcome back.
Sorry we lost you.
Thank you.
I was just saying that I have tried not to let the clock be our governor or our weapon, but I want to honor that we're past our time that we set aside, and that you all may have things to go on to do, like dinner.
Yes.
And I want to especially thank you, Tom, and Rev Free for stepping into a space and doing a job and taking a responsibility that is not yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your experience and your stories are valuable to us, and we hope that they are also valuable to our congregation and our Facebook audience and YouTube too. Forgot about that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I sat in on one a few weeks ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed that session. And I talked to Daryl or Darnell did the other one.
Darrell.
Yeah, he thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm also glad that, as I said to you, Jeffrey, that you decided to distinguish this group with 2 graduates from the School of the Prophets. I'm just saying. Thank you.
What, Perkins?
We don't even acknowledge Perkins. We don't acknowledge Perkins.
Well,
No, seriously, this has been a joy. It really has, and it's been good. It's been good for me.
Thanks.
And Reverend Free, it is good to meet you.
Yes, you too. You too.
And
You too, Slats and Stephanie. Will we have a little mini bio
Yes.
that sent us an email? Because I want to be able to connect and.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, let's connect.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I want to thank Slats and Steph for stepping into, especially
Sure.
especially into space that was unknown, and being willing to be vulnerable with us. So we'll end our broadcast and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Blessings. Have a great
Blessings,
rest
everyone.
of the vacation.